Right, so we continue our series this morning in Colossians, Look Up. And the whole series has been about kind of taking a bigger view of things. And so the first few chapters of Colossians, the first two, not few, two chapters of Colossians are quite theologithat, right? This is who Jesus is. This is what Jesus has done. This is the context within which we live our lives. And we recognize that there's creation. God created everything. It was good. It's been broken by human sin. And God is in the process of redeeming and recreating all things. And the pinnacle of his activity to that end has been the person of Jesus of Nazareth, his life, death, and resurrection. And then also ascension, sending the Spirit into the world for this recreative thing that's happening. And we're living in that while we await Christ's return to bring to full fulfillment this recreation, where the new creation is established and we live in that new creation, where there is no more death or mourning or crying or pain, where things like disease and anger and rage and jealousy and all this kind of stuff is no more, but we live with peace with God, peace with each other, and peace with creation, like we know in our gut it ought to be, but we just simply can't quite seem to get there, no matter our politics, our education, our science, or economics. Okay? So that's kind of what we've been doing. Now in chapter 3, Paul starts to get a little bit more practical about talking about this distinct people that he has created that are his and how we live differently from the world around us. Well, I mean, other people might do some of the same things we do as God's people, but we're supposed to hold these as sort of a cultural distinction. All right? And so we talked about things like being forgiving. Like our cultural wardrobe, as it were, is to be full of kindness and have a gut of mercy, to have compassion, patience, bearing with each other, forgiving one another, having this love that brings all that together into something unified. We talked about having the peace of Christ, the logic of Christ, the logic of having peace with one another through enduring a bit of shame and a bit of personal loss in order to extend grace, mercy, and forgiveness to someone else. That logic, that way of thinking needs to sort of dwell in us and be the umpire in our hearts when whatever happens and my heart responds, that umpire in my heart needs to be this idea, the peace of Christ, the forgiveness and the love that we've experienced in him. And that we should do all these things with gratitude and thanks. Now we're moving into something that is really quite practical. And we're going to get into sort of how do households function in this new people. Depending on where you go in the world, you might encounter different family dynamics. Like, so for instance, if you were to go to the West Bank, you would see a family dynamic where houses get built and they just kind of keep on going one level higher to about 3, rarely 4 stories. Because what happens is a family has a home, and then they have kids. And then one of the kids gets married and builds another level to the home, right? And then grandkids happen, and they get married and build another level to the home. And you'll have like grandparents, parents, and grandkids, and all of their sort of family in a particular structure. And then what happens is when the grandparents die, then everyone kind of moves down a level. Yeah. Because the older you are, the harder it is to go up those stairs. You know what I mean? It's quite that's the kind of thing that you might see. And you might go to sub-Saharan Africa and experience a family dynamic that's a little bit different. And depending on where you go in the world, how families interact and how families sort of organize themselves is a cultural sort of expression. Similarly, for the people of God, we have a family cultural expression. For the people of God, the family is the principal social unit and the principal worshiping unit. What's interesting, you have for the Jewish people, you have the two most significant holidays are the Day of Atonement, right, and the Passover. The Day of Atonement, where sacrifices are made at the temple for the sins of the whole nation, and it's kind of pushing the reset button. It's Jewish New Year. All right, what's gone is cleared away, and now we've got a fresh start for the new year. And then Passover, rather than being worshipped at the temple and with the priesthood, it is observed in homes by families and neighbors. The family unit is the principal social and worshiping unit for the people of God. Now, that nuclear family unit might have been placed on a pedestal and become idolatrous. We kind of worship that. To correct an overemphasis on the nuclear family isn't to disregard the value of the nuclear family. Right? We want to kind of find that happy middle and find this plumb line of what is the family like? What is the household like? Now, Paul is going to be writing to a particular cultural context, and certainly how we are as a family, as the people of God, is going to interface with our cultural norms. And so we're going to read in a moment about wives and husbands and kids and slaves and masters. What? We want to be careful to sort of park our North Atlantic slave trade understanding of slavery into this particular sort of thing. And Allison is going to be sharing next week about slaves and masters, and she's going to knock it out of the park. It's going to be incredible. All right? This morning, we're going to be talking about wives, husbands, and children. And now we might go, well, hold on, okay? Two things. All of Scripture is for all of us. So whether you're married or not, whether you have kids or not, whether you're single by choice or not, whatever, whether you're not, all of Scripture is for all of us because we all exist in community. Okay? So we all need to kind of be on the same page on all of these things. That's really helpful. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, I'm going to read a text, and some of us are going to go, okay, and understandably so. And when some of us go, you know what we're going to be tempted to do? Go, you know what this text really means? We all just need to be loving and thoughtful of one another. And if we're all just husbands, wives, kids, if we're all just loving and thoughtful of one another, then everything's going to be okay. That's not wrong. But also, can I be honest? I've heard this text preached like that, for decades. And I'm not sure that it's helping families. Because do you remember we had our series, The Human, a while back? We are embodied creatures, and our bodies matter. We're also theological creatures. We are the image of God in creation. And so that matters. And so for the people of God, what we want to do is align our bodies and our theology, knowing that it's going to be quite tricky because we live currently in brokenness. And so in some ways, it's easier to maintain the patterns of brokenness because they're familiar. And the difficulties that come from brokenness are familiar, and we know how to kind of roll with it. And choosing a different set of difficulties is a problem because oh man, now I need to exchange the familiar for the unfamiliar. I think I'll roll with the status quo. Let's just all be nice to each other. I'm going to read this text, and then we're going to unpack it, knowing that as people, we are embodied, we are theological, we are broken, and our aim is to go towards healing and restoration. Okay? Chapter 3, verse 18 of Colossians. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, don't embitter your kids. Now, first thing, wives, submit to your husbands. Not so sure how I feel. Somebody like, yes, I was not. Let's check our Western cultural baggage. Right? Because this is talking about the culture of God's people. Western cultural baggage actually despises submission and elevates leadership. We prize being a leader. We reward being a leader. We see leaders as being in a smaller supply and a higher demand. Therefore, we put a price point or a value on leadership that is different from submission. We don't like the vulnerability of submission either. That's why we prize leadership, because leadership is less vulnerable. Leadership is being in charge. Leadership is getting your way. Leadership isn't making yourself vulnerable or subject to someone else's decisions. And so we promote leadership and we despise submission, and we see being a leader as being almost like existentially better than a submitter. Tap out. That's how we understand submission. You don't have the power to resist, and so you must tap out and give in. That's our cultural persuasion around leadership and submission. However, in God himself, leadership and submission is not that way. Jesus submits himself to the Father. The Father, I've heard it said that the Father submits to the Son, but there is nowhere in Scripture that indicates this, aside from Jesus saying, anything I ask the Father, he'll give to me. But he also says that I don't do anything of my own accord, but I only do what I see my Father do and say what I hear my Father say. So it's actually in his submission to the Father that then he turns around and says, yeah, Father, what about this? And the Father says, well, yeah, of course, because you're in submission to me. Submission, it would be a rank error to suggest for just one moment that God the Son is any less God, any less powerful, in any way, shape, or form less than the Father, yet submits to the leadership of the Father. And the Father loves the Son. Who they are in their essence is not determined by how they function in their relationship with one another. What you do does not determine what you're worth. Western society says what you do determines what you're worth. So you better get good grades on these exams coming up, and you better go off to a good uni, and you better get a good job, and it better be respectable, and it better be something that you can be proud of, and it better make you a good bit of money so you can go on certain holidays, and you buy certain things, and you can have a certain life. Because if that happens, then you're worth something. And your worth is indicated in all that you have and all that you do. The culture of God's people says, bull crap. That is not true. Your worth is something that you inherently possess because you are God's image in creation, no matter how broken or obscured. And so that worth that you have is brought to whatever you do. So if taking out the bins is done by a human being, it is worthy because a human is doing it. If submitting is something that God does within himself, submitting is worthy. And we all have submissive relationships. But remember, humanity is theological as well as embodied and biological. We're meant to be the image of God in creation. So since God, in his triune self, has the first person who leads and is the head, and the second person who submits, and they are wrapped up in this third person of loving unity, that then gets seen in the households of God's people. And can I suggest for a moment that there's a lot of female anxiety and a lot of male depression because we're not living into these things. It's not the only reason for anxiety and depression. Please don't misunderstand. But male depression tends to exhibit itself primarily in two ways. Not exclusively, but primarily in two ways. Intoxication and throwing himself into work. I remember when I was for a while, I worked in flood remediation and mold remediation, right? And so somebody's basement would flood and we would get all the water out and get all soggy furniture out and we'd cut out all the moldy stuff and whatever. It's hard work. Sometimes in the middle of the night, you get a phone call, oh, my pipe burst, basement's flooded, and we go in. And I remember talking with one guy, he's like, oh, at least we'll be able, it's Friday, we'll be able to go home, you'll be able to rest. He goes, what? I go to work to rest. And for a lot of men, we go to work to rest. Because work makes sense. Work has clear rules. Work, I can leave behind. And I can go to the pub, I have a few with the boys, and I can distract myself and numb myself from this anxiety. And I think culturally, we get that on a couple of different levels. We need to understand that everyone in this room has been raised by somebody who was raised by a man, or not raised by a man, who was deeply affected by 2 world wars. The post-traumatic stress, the emotional damage, the psychological damage of that resulted in a generation of people being raised by a dad who's disciplinarian or just not there. Emotionally stunted, understandably so. It's not a judgment, it's an observation. Pour himself into work, provide the right kind of life for your family, and drink enough to just be able to forget when you're not being distracted by work. In the absence of loving male leadership, I think a generation of women said, I'm the one who's got to do it. And maybe even liked being able to take that control at a certain level. And I think this has gotten all turned around. I think there are a lot of men who throw themselves into intoxication and work, and a lot of women who are stepping up and taking hold of things that actually aren't theirs to take hold of. And here's kids floating around in there somewhere. With neither mom nor dad, with the kind of energy that is required to not just raise children, but disciple them. To teach them about what it means to love and follow Jesus. And maybe that's because the parents don't have time to develop what it means to love and follow Jesus, because guys are so busy throwing themselves into something else, and women are so busy taking charge. I understand that what I'm putting forward might be a bit in our space. And I'm not putting it forward as one who's got it right myself. Right? I'm just putting it forward as this is the plumb line for the culture of God's people. And so long as guys, we're throwing ourselves into our work and the distraction and whatever that might happen to be, and women, so long as we're trying to grab hold and secure ourselves by taking control, we're obscuring the image of God in humanity. And people are left wondering, what's God like? I'm not sure. Children, obey your parents in everything. Kids, listen up. This is why we have kids in the service. This is kids programming. Like, Peter, they don't know what you're talking about half the time. No, they don't, but I promise you they're listening. I promise you they're listening. Kids, Obey your parents. Obviously, if your parent asks you to do something immoral or illegal, you obey God first. Right? We always obey God first. Especially if someone's asking you to do something immoral, it's naughty, it's wrong, or illegal. You're not allowed to do that according to the law. Otherwise, obey your parents. They don't hate you. They love you. They want what's best for you. Sometimes you don't understand why they're asking you to do what they're asking you to do, or why they're telling you, not asking, telling you. Kids, your parents don't need to ask you to do anything. When they do, it's a courtesy of love. They are in charge. When they tell you to do something, you ought to do it. And that teaches us that sometimes God tells us to do stuff that we don't fully understand. But He loves us, it's for our good, and we should do it. We should do it. Kids, it's really, really important. Which also means parents, and interesting. I'm sorry, guys, and this is, he doesn't talk about mothers here. Mothers can embitter their kids. Don't misunderstand. There's probably a fair few of us who have experienced that. But this instruction is to the fathers. Because fathers are intended by God to lovingly lead, to set the tone. We need to be really careful as parents, particularly as fathers, that we're intentional about what we instruct the kids to do. That's not just for our comfort or ease. But is thoughtful of the whole family. Don't embitter your kids, or they will become discouraged. Embitter, more like just make them lose heart. A disheartened kid towards their parent, especially their dad, there's nothing I can do to please you, Dad. It just doesn't matter. There's always another hoop to jump for you. There's always another task to do. It's never good enough. I'm never right enough. I just don't ever live up. Why would that kid listen to you about anything? Don't embitter, discourage, cause your kids to lose heart. Because also, guys, we talk about God the Father. That means that whatever I am as a father is going to paint a picture for my kids about God. The picture my kids have isn't perfect. Please don't misunderstand. Please don't misunderstand. And I feel this from my failures as much as anything else. But guys, we have the honor and the privilege of being associate to God in that way. Who or what does your kid think God is like based on you as a dad? And actually, who do I have in my life to help me see my blind spots? Be like, dude, Nevins, by the way, I know you're a priest and whatnot. Maybe I'm out of order. No, you're not. Please. But actually, what about that? Ooh, okay, yeah. Or better yet, Peter, when I saw you doing that with your kids, dude, that was beautiful. Thank you, because I'm so aware of how I muck it up day in and day out. I really appreciate that encouragement. I need that. I need that. For the people of God, the family unit is the principal social and worshiping unit. We were created with bodies in order to reveal something of God to his world. We do that, men, as we step up into that perhaps uncomfortable place of leadership. Of loving leadership. Women, you do that as you honor that leadership and aren't tempted to try and take hold of that for yourself. Kids, as you obey your parents, you reveal something of God and his love to the world. Fathers, as we lovingly lead our families, we show the world something of who God is, what God is like, so they can see, believe, join God's people, and be blessed by the restorative culture, the loving, forgiving, patient, peaceful, grateful culture that his kingdom is known by. In a moment, we're going to have a time of sung worship as we prepare to come to confession. Again, confession is just a time to be like, God, here it is. Here's my stuff. And it might be something completely unrelated to what I've been sharing this morning. But here's one of the things that we can be thinking about. How am I being a father? How am I being a mother? How am I being a wife? How am I being a husband? How am I supporting the husbands, fathers, wives, and husbands? Wives and mothers, and kids in my community? How are we supporting each other? Am I ready? Maybe. Actually, one thing is, am I ready to step into the culture of God's people? Or is the familiar discomfort of our culture of origin more enticing than the unfamiliar discomfort of the culture of God's people? These are some things that perhaps we can be thinking about as we prepare our hearts and our minds for our time of confession. So, worship team, if you'd like to come up and lead us in some sung worship, and we'll stand to do that.